Ever since I knew what video games were, I've been hooked on RPGs. From the old CRPG classics like Baldur's Gate, the BioWare greats like Mass Effect and the Knights of the Old Republic series, and even some very niche titles like Summoner, A Goddess Reborn, and Quest 64. Those grand character driven adventures stayed with me over the years, the same way they have for millions of others. And, I'm willing to bet, for you. So, what if I told you that there was a game that managed to capture the spirit of those older games, while only being made by one person? Hi, I'm Graham. Normally I play old school RuneScape here on YouTube, but today we're going to be doing something a little different. Gedonia is an older style of action RPG in the Elder Scrolls or Divinity 2 vein, where you play a custom character through a fantasy adventure. At least until you get distracted by the piles of side content, if you're anything like me. And from what I can gather, the game was made by a single person. Graphically, it isn't much to look at, but from a story and gameplay perspective, there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. So enough with the background information, let's dive right in. Character creation starts with picking a look from a handful of design choices and naming your character. It's done in the way that's become more or less standard in RPGs since at least the Morrowind days. And I never put too much effort into my character's looks anyways, so meet Babette. The most important part of character creation comes next. Like most RPGs, you start with a certain number of stat points that you can spread across 4 attributes that'll help define your abilities through the game. Unlike most RPGs, however, these stat points can't be changed once you finish making your character. If you put all your points in strength, you can't add points to your agility later. While this may sound limiting, once you know how the game plays, it's easy to build a character that's good in 1 or 2 areas that matter for the build you're aiming for. However, this does mean that it's not unusual to play a character for an hour or so before deciding you may want to try something different, so early on you may find yourself restarting a lot. The stats themselves are nothing out of the ordinary. Strength is your go-to stat if you want to walk softly and carry a big stick. High strength allows you to wear heavy armor and use two-handed weapons, and some quests can be solved through a show of muscle that won't be open to other characters. Intellect governs how much XP your character earns and how well you can use magic. In fact, with fewer than 2 points of intellect, you can't use magic at all, and less than 1 locks you out of crafting entirely. Quest solutions involving intellect are ones where the problem can be solved with a well-reasoned argument or the little application of magic. Charisma determines how many companions you can have and how good your prices at merchants are. It's also the stat I've played with the least, though from my little time with it, it already seems like it might be the strongest of the 4. The bard and speech-based builds are very silly. Finally, agility is probably the most useful of the 4. It covers your character's ability with bows and 2-weapon fighting, the typical rogue stuff. But it can also allow you to double jump, and completely removes fall damage after a certain point. The final level in any stat costs 2 points, which means that you can have a character who excels in one area, or a character who's okay in a couple of them. Babette here is going to be a mage, so I'll max out my intellect, and to really commit to it, I'll remove my point in strength and put that into agility. Just give myself a little bit of an ability to dodge, at the cost of not being able to equip even leather armor, which I wasn't gonna do anyway. With character creation out of the way, it's time to start playing. We open with a cutscene that sets the stage for a very typical fantasy adventure. Our character has been having weird dreams about a cave on top of the local mountain, and our uncle tells us that we should go if we want to find out what it all means. Also, we didn't know our parents, as we were left on our uncle's doorstep as a baby, which I'm pretty sure is the free space on the fantasy protagonist bingo card. That's followed with a sweeping flyover of the starting valley, which really highlights one of the game's strengths early. While the graphical fidelity is what you'd expect from a game made by one person, the artistic direction is actually quite good, to the point where this game can be just shockingly beautiful sometimes. With all that, the game opens up before us. The main quests are level locked, meaning that you need to be at a minimum level to start them, so the game expects that you'll engage with at least some of the side content, and that is all front and center here at the start. Once you have control of your character, you can tackle side quests, go do some dungeons, join one of 8 factions in the game, or just explore and see what's out there. The world's at your fingertips, and how you approach it from here is left up to you. Now, Babette here wants to be a good person, so the first thing that we do is join the Holy Monastery faction. It's geared towards paladin types, but since we have no strength, we're going to try out the other build that the faction is good for. There are 20 different skill trees in this game that cover everything from how well you can hit things to your ability to cook a decent meal. And all told, the game has about 16 different character builds. With 4 intellect and having joined the monastery, we're angling towards something I've never done: the Holy Magic Caster build. Magic functions in a very interesting way in Gedonia. Rather than each school having set spells, for the most part, there's a small shared pool of spells and a bunch of different skills that change the element and, by extension, the effect of the spell. It's a very flexible system that can lead to several different builds, which gives magic as a whole kind of a Swiss Army knife approach to problems. Each faction quest requires us to speak to someone in the starting area for more guidance, so we talk to our uncle about joining the monastery. He tells us that he doesn't know how to join himself, but we may want to go kill the necromancer in the abandoned ruins to the northwest. That sounds a bit above our pay grade, even being marked as a level 1 quest, so we'll want to gain some levels and get some better gear before we do that. This is also where we can get an idea of how factions work in the game. Many of the factions are diametrically opposed, and joining one can cause the others to become aggressive, like the bandits versus the warriors. If we joined the necromancers instead of the monastery, for example, we'd actually need to go talk to the necromancer that we've been tasked to kill, and every paladin would start attacking us on sight. Like most fantasy RPGs, the world of Gedonia is huge, and travel can be quite a burden with no way to get around quickly. Fortunately, the game has a large variety of mounts, and we start right next to the first one. Just a standard horse. Its owner tells us that he'll give us the horse if we can fix the well in town. Besides being our first introduction to mounts, this is also how the game introduces us to using skills to solve quests. There are 4 different ways to fix the well depending on what your stats are, and we're able to use our smarts to find the right tool for the job. Of course, the quest giver immediately moves the goalposts, but that just requires killing a few more enemies before we can get our horse. The whole area around the starting village serves as a tutorial for the game, and one of the most interesting parts of the tutorial is the quest that teaches you that many of the quests have multiple solutions. Outside of town is a large tree with golden apples. You can talk to this tree. It has depression. Tired of seeing its apples being taken by ungrateful villagers, the tree has sunken so deep into its anger and sorrow that it started to affect its fruit. You're presented with 2 choices, one uncaring and one empathetic. If you respond kindly, you get a good apple that you need to find a home for. You can give it to the village gardener to plant, to the fisherman for lunch, or even eat it yourself. But none of these are terribly satisfying. Instead, we're going to go talk to the gardener, who's having a bit of a conundrum. She and the village baker are in love, but she wants children and he's infertile, so she doesn't know what to do. We suggest that they adopt the local orphan girl before giving the apple to the baker. He uses it for an engagement tart, which she happily accepts, and the 2 go off to make the marriage official. It's a very sweet little resolution to the quest, with a happily ever after for 2 NPCs that, at least in theory, our character has known for their entire lives. But what if we did things differently? Meet Bob. Instead of a mage, he's going to be a thief, and rather than joining the monastery, he's going to join the bandits instead. He's selfish, arrogant, and only ever looks out for number 1. When he picks up the quest, he decides to ask for an apple, either because he wasn't listening or just doesn't care. The tree insults him and throws him 2 apples that look just like the other one. Talking to the gardener, we instead tell her that she should dump the baker before giving him the apple anyways. Things go about as you would expect, and the baker eats the tart himself out of disappointment. It turns out the apples that we got were poisoned, and the baker dies. Oops. But we still need to figure out what to do with the last apple. You know, the fisherman looks pretty hungry. What I love about this quest is it does something that's so rare in RPGs these days, at least I feel. There are several perfectly reasonable ways to finish the quest that allow you to decide for yourself how your character approaches the situation. In short, it allows you to roleplay in this role-playing game. And it doesn't shy away from the consequences of your choices. If you give the poisoned apples to the villagers, they are gone for the rest of the game. While not every quest allows for this kind of freedom, there are a lot that do, and it helps make those quests that much more memorable. Back with Babette, we start working on getting some better gear while we're gaining some levels to take on the Necromancer. Crafting gear is a major mechanic in this game, as your equipment goes a long way in determining how much damage you deal and how well you can take a hit. For low and mid-level characters, crafted gear is almost always better than what you can buy, though faction gear and the endgame gear you get from bosses and other challenges does mean that it isn't fully necessary to engage with. You just need to figure out for yourself whether you want to trade a tougher start for a few more skill points down the line. Personally, I like having level-appropriate gear, especially on a mage, so I always make sure to spend some time grinding bandits in the valley for strips of cloth. This gets us really into the meat of combat. As a caster, your armor and skills are geared towards making sure that you do the most damage you can, and maybe regenerating mana if you're lucky. So enemies getting in close can be a real problem. With our 2 points of agility, we do have a limited ability to dodge, though it's too short to be particularly useful. Sprinting is how we get out of tight situations, so most of our early combat encounters settle into a rhythm of throwing our magic spells at the enemies until they get too close, before sprinting out of harm's reach and starting again. It can make for some surprisingly tense encounters if the enemies are fast, and almost pathetic encounters if the enemies are slow. The exception to this are ranged enemies. Enemies with ranged attacks in this game tend to hit very hard, sometimes enough to down your character in one hit, and they also often have AoE attacks that you'll need to dodge. These attacks come in one of two flavors. Either outlines on the ground that fill up before the attack goes off, in a similar vein to how a lot of MMOs do it, or a wide fan that can make them really dangerous in multiples. In my mind, the most interesting combat encounters come from the dungeons. They function very similarly to the kind of dungeons that you'd see in something like Skyrim, a series of combat encounters and puzzles that lead to a boss fight at the very end. There are a few dungeons in each region, and they're all designed around the level range for the zone. This does mean if you're like me and forget to do them until you're over-leveled, they do tend to be pretty easy. But taking them on at the right level can lead to some of the most fun you can have with this combat system. Each dungeon has its own theme, usually in keeping with the theme for the region, and they also introduce puzzle mechanics that are typically unique to the dungeon. Which is a real shame, because there are some decently clever puzzles, like one in one of the first dungeons that you can encounter, the Cursed Prison. The story behind the dungeon is that it was the last holdout for a company of paladins. They fell to a group of necromancers, and now their champion, Sir Richard, is cursed to exist as a powerful undead in the prison's depths. It's a neat setup for a dungeon full of undead, and things get even more interesting when we run into a blockage that we can't get past. Searching a nearby room gives us the story for the dungeon, and also a ring that will serve as a tool to solve the upcoming puzzles. Using the ring sends out a beam of magic that pulls us to it when it touches one of the glowing rings throughout the dungeon. That allows us to reach higher floors that we can't jump to, as well as moving objects around. After making our way through the dungeon, we find what is definitely not a fog wall, leading to a fight with Richard himself. He's tough, combining strong sword attacks with some dark magic spells, and he very nearly kills me. Fortunately, my holy magic does more than enough damage to end the fight in a few hits, and we're rewarded with some loot. We can also take Richard's remains back to his coffin, which rewards some extra experience and caps the little side story off nicely. And that's just this dungeon. Other dungeons can require you to direct beams of fire to melt ice that's blocking the way forward, or complete circuits to open doors, or even just be as simple as fighting your way through a volcano. Well, I wouldn't say every dungeon is great. The majority have enough challenge and creativity to make themselves some of the most memorable parts of the game for me. So, with the gameplay side of things out of the way, how's the story? Well, to put it simply, the story is much better than I had expected when I first sat down to play. It's no masterpiece, and it won't surprise you too much if you've read a lot of fantasy, but it's more competent than I've seen from a lot of games in the genre. It's a fun ride with a couple of neat quirks, and if you don't want any spoilers, then you can skip to the timestamp on screen. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive into it in a bit more detail. Following after the opening cutscene, we head up the mountain. The cave near the village holds an ancient ruin that reacts to our presence by showing us a vision of two dudes in armor punching each other. We don't know what that means, and neither does our uncle, so he sends us to a man named Ernest Hoffner. He's an archaeologist and an expert in the ancient Voflar people, who lived in the region before disappearing millennia ago and leaving only ruins behind. Ernest is more than happy to help once he sees the runes that we draw for him. I get the feeling he had nothing else going on. Though his assistant Wayana thinks that we're wasting his time, and hers, and wants nothing to do with us. Wayana introduces us to one of the few major problems with the game. The voice acting is, on the whole, pretty awful.
Yeah, we are all interested in hearing your dreams and fantasies, right? Get out of here, you daydreamer.
Wayana, come on, we don't treat visitors this way.
Are you going to believe every nut that comes here with a crazy story, Ernest? I'm sick of this.
And what's worse is that it used to be, if not better, at least more interesting. Every line Wayana has is delivered with zero emotion, just a totally flat performance. It used to be at least a little better in that regard. At some point between the first time that I played the game and now, the voice acting was updated. Now, to be clear, the old vocal performance wasn't good. In fact, I'd say it was almost charmingly bad. But at least the actress put some emotion in her lines. Now everything, no matter what her character is saying, is read with no expression at all. And I know voice acting and voice direction are both hard, but this really does put a damper on getting invested in the characters. Voice acting issues aside, Ernest can't translate the runes, but he might know someone who can. He tells Wayana to guide us across the Golden Forest to the camp where the rest of the archaeologists are setting up for the post-game content, to see if someone there can help us out. She is absolutely thrilled to go and wastes no time in complaining about having to babysit us. After a lot of back and forth going over our character's backstory, we make camp for the night and get attacked by some bandits who really should know better than to try to rob the main character of the game. They T-pose to assert dominance, which works out about as well for them as you might imagine. We then save Wayana from another bandit who obviously had not been paying attention, and a bit of friendly banter finally starts to break the ice. At the archaeologist camp, Wayana starts giving us the rundown of how things work here, and for some reason our character just wanders off in the middle of the explanation. I have no idea why we do this, but I kinda love it. We ask around a bit to find someone who can translate the runes, and two of the scientists, one of whom will haunt my dreams forever, point us to someone named Dracus, with the vaguest description possible. We follow the marker to Dracus, and for some reason, just insult the man to his face. But he takes it in stride before cracking a joke that not even I would make. Wayana storms off, and we follow her out of camp, rune translation more or less forgotten. Returning to Ernest, we find him in a heap in the side of the house. Clearly, there's something wrong with him, but we don't know what it is just yet. Wayana takes him inside to get cleaned up before heading off to her sister's house. Once she leaves, Ernest tells us he managed to find mention of the lost temple of the Voflar, and he thinks the runes might be key to finding it. We're treated to a cutscene of some obvious bad guys showing up at Wayana's sister's home. She recognizes one as Prince Gabriel before the wizard with him stabs her and kidnaps her sister. We start getting a bit worried because she's not back when we expected her, and we go to find her nearly dead and the house on fire. So Ernest rushes her back to his house to tend her wounds. While she's recovering, we make our way to the Lost Temple alone to discover that it's already been destroyed, though we're still able to find a prophecy regarding the two gods from the beginning. From what we can tell, the gods of light and dark return every so often to select a champion to fight in their honor. Naturally, given our mysterious birth and the dreams we were having, we figure we must be one of those people. And while we're doing that, we get a cutscene of Prince Gabriel taking Wyana's sister back somewhere. He seems nicer than you'd expect, though he does just cryptically go on about destiny and being chosen by powers beyond us. It seems his plan is to become the Dark God's successor, and he's going to sacrifice Wyana's sister to do it. And one thing I will say about the story so far, while I'm interested in seeing where it's going, it's very front-loaded on the cutscenes. There are several missions in a row where you are just going from one cutscene to another, and that's all you're doing. Back in the present, Wyana's awake, and Ernest is going through another one of his episodes. It turns out he's been treating PTSD from an archaeology accident that killed most of his friends with a potentially deadly combination of plants. We help him get settled, and Wyana tells us what happened to her sister. This leads to a long heart-to-heart that really does a good job of starting to build a genuine friendship between the main character and Wyana, though we do call her the strongest person we know after only 3 days. Our character did grow up in a tiny village, so maybe she really is the strongest out of the 12 people that we've met. Either way, Wyana's sure that her sister's being held in the prison in Erturon, the capital city, so we head off to stage a daring prison break. There also seems to be some bad blood between Wyana and Gabriel going back to before the recent incident, but I don't think that's ever elaborated on. It's a shame because I really feel like that would help flesh out both characters. Breaking into the palace, we eavesdrop on Gabriel and the wizard going over parts of their plan. It seems that they need to get to a flying temple that sits inside a large anti-magic field, and something they're going to do there will take the power of the Dark God and give it to Gabriel. Apparently, this cycle of combat between the two has happened many times through the millennia, and each time the gods completely take over the body and mind of their chosen champion. To me, this would put a little bit of a damper on our destiny, but we're surprisingly accepting of the idea of becoming the Light God's puppet. After fighting our way through the prison, we manage to free Wyana's sister, though that doesn't last long. The mage destroys our cart and recaptures her in a cutscene that is genuinely great, though it does lead into the one level in the game I hate the most. He sets the forest on fire, with us in it, and for some reason that causes the entire place to become full of fire elementals and these random geysers of flame. They always pop up in the same places, but there's no warning for when they're going to happen, and they hit hard. It takes a few tries, but we do manage to make it out alive. We now know what the villain's plan is, and we still need to save Wyana's sister, which means that we need to solve the same problem that they do with the anti-magic field. Ernest offers up riding a dragon as the solution, and that is just crazy enough to work. Fortunately for us, there's someone who claims to be the only person in Gedonia to ever tame a dragon. He's an obvious braggart, enough so that no one else pays him any attention, but he perks up at the opportunity we give him. With the dragon tamer secured, we head off to the ruined fortress where one is rumored to dwell. And at this point, Bobette has gotten strong enough to fly faster than most of the mounts in the game can run, and that's just got to be one of my favorite ways to travel. I wish more games gave you the chance to do that when you're a high enough level. Naturally, the dragon is awake, and very angry, so we have to sneak past it to a safe place so the dragon tamer can do his thing. Not gonna lie, this scene is pretty funny. Dragon in tow, we take off to the floating temple, which goes about as well as you would expect. We get our first proper conversation with Gabriel, which still really makes me wish he got more fleshed out in the story. And now we're here in the final stretch. Wyana managed to escape the crash and disrupts the ritual, leaving us to deal with the wizard. In my first playthrough, this guy was the hardest fight in the game by far. It was an epic magic duel with me getting a hit or two in when I could, and using my flight to dodge away from his attacks. Things were much easier this time around. Right on cue, the Dark God shows up, and we actually get a pretty solid plot twist. We are not, like we had assumed, the champion of the Light God. We're the champion of the Dark. The amulet that we picked up at the Vaflar Temple protects us from the mind control, and we head into the Dark God's pocket dimension for a showdown. Along the way, we find out that our character isn't even really human. We were created by the Dark God to be the perfect vessel, the one that could learn and grow and far outstrip the power of an ordinary human. Honestly, it's a great way to explain the RPG mechanics in the story. The reason that we go from being barely able to throw a fireball to an unstoppable force of holy magic in a few hours was we were quite literally designed that way. Maybe a little too well, as the Dark God goes down even faster than the Mage did. But of course, there wasn't only one god, and the Light God shows up for the fight just as expected. He rejects Prince Gabriel, which is just such a fitting way to end the character, before choosing Wyanna as his champion. The whole temple comes crashing down, and we have to face off with the strongest person we know. It's no contest, but we're able to save our longtime traveling companion. A few final words to send off Prince Gabriel, and we head home to put an end to this adventure. We've come a long way in our time in Gedonia. Such a long way that the man that raised us doesn't even recognize us at first. The music swells, the camera pulls back over the landscape, and we end on a sentiment about found family that's very sweet, even if it doesn't have a ton to do with everything that just happened. And that's the game. It is, beyond a doubt in my mind, a true testament to what a solo dev project can be. Between the factions, the dungeons, and all the different options for character builds, the developer's vision is incredibly ambitious. And for the most part, that ambition is well realized, even if the game's not always the most polished or well-balanced. The game can keep you busy for a good 10 to 15 hours on your first playthrough, depending on how much of a completionist you want to be. And the post-game has at least as much content. I wasn't really able to cover it in the video, but besides the Darklands region and the expedition quests, there's a whole other map in the Northern Kingdoms area that adds a ton of high-level dungeons and quests. It's not the kind of game that's going to appeal to everyone, but if this thing looks like your kind of thing, I can't recommend it enough. And that's all we have time for today. I've been enjoying working on this new, more scripted format for my videos, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. I'm also always open to suggestions of other games to look at, so if there's something you think could be fun, leave it down in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did making it, and I will catch you in the next one.